The night was very peaceful. The familiar sounds of the day gradually faded, and the room became a little quieter. I lay down, feeling my breath slow, as if the whole world was calming down at the same time. Many things had passed through my mind today. Thoughts, small worries, unresolved issues. But as night fell, I realized I didn't need to carry all of that into my sleep. I just needed to stop, breathe more slowly, and let my heart settle before God. There is one thing that always brings me peace when night comes. When I rest, God is still quietly at work. He doesn't need noise to work in my life. Even in the quiet of the night, faith is nurtured gently, little by little. I remembered a simple yet profound verse from the Bible. Commit your way to the Lord. Psalm 37 verse 5. Those words were a gentle reminder that I didn't need to control everything. There are things best left in His hands before I close my eyes. So tonight, I just want to slow my heart, let the burdens of the day lighten, and enter into rest with the belief that God is still taking care of me in every quiet moment of the night. This afternoon began like any other. I was sitting in my room, the late afternoon light gently shining through the window. Everything seemed very normal. I felt no pain, and nothing special happened. But then I suddenly noticed my heart was beating a little faster than usual. Not too strongly, not too noticeably, just enough for me to pay attention to it. Have you ever experienced that feeling, when a very small thing suddenly makes your mind start thinking more than usual? At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was probably just because I'd had coffee, or maybe I was just a little tired. But a few minutes passed, and that heartbeat still caught my attention. And then, as is very common these days, I reached for my phone. I typed a few simple words into the search bar, just to check, just to know a little more. But you know what happens when we start searching for minor symptoms online? In just a few seconds, a flood of information appeared on the screen. Initially, there were fairly normal explanations, mild causes, things that weren't worth worrying about. But then I scrolled down a bit, and other results started appearing. Phrases that sounded more serious, articles about illnesses that easily made readers feel uneasy. And strangely, after reading just a few lines, my imagination began to wander far beyond what was actually happening. I put the phone down for a moment, but my mind hadn't stopped. Thoughts began to race, small questions popping into my head. What if what I had just read wasn't just general information? What if my body was signaling something more serious? Had I overlooked a sign I should have noticed sooner? And in that moment, I realized something many of us have probably experienced. In just a few minutes, from a very small feeling, my mind began to construct scenarios that made me much more anxious. My body remained almost unchanged, but the fear in my head was growing. Then I remembered a verse from the Bible. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Psalm 56 verse 3. That Bible verse came to me as a gentle reminder that perhaps what I needed right now wasn't more information, but a return to trusting in God. I wondered, are we sometimes like that too? We begin with a very small worry, but then let our thoughts lead us too far. And it is in moments like these that faith isn't about noise or drama, but simply a very simple choice. Stop, breathe, and remember that God is still there, even when our minds are full of questions. I sat still for a while, trying to let things return to normal. The room was still the same as before. The afternoon light had softened. Nothing had really changed around me. But in my head, the thoughts continued to move. I noticed something strange. My body was almost the same as a few minutes earlier, but my mind was telling me increasingly frightening stories. Have you ever experienced that feeling, when a small thought gradually leads to a series of other thoughts? And in that moment, I realized something many of us have probably experienced. In just a few minutes, from a very small feeling, my mind began to construct scenarios that made me much more anxious. My body remained almost unchanged, but the fear in my head was growing. Then I remembered a verse from the Bible. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Psalm 56, verse 3. That Bible verse came to me as a gentle reminder that perhaps what I needed right now wasn't more information, but a return to trusting in God. I wondered, are we sometimes like that too? We begin with a very small worry, but then let our thoughts lead us too far. And it is in moments like these that faith isn't about noise or drama, but simply a very simple choice. Stop, breathe, and remember that God is still there, even when our minds are full of questions. I sat still for a while, trying to let things return to normal. The room was still the same as before. The afternoon light had softened. Nothing had really changed around me. But in my head, the thoughts continued to move. I noticed something strange. My body was almost the same as a few minutes earlier, but my mind was telling me increasingly frightening stories. Have you ever experienced that feeling, when a small thought gradually leads to a series of other thoughts? I picked up my phone again, as if to double-check to make sure I hadn't missed anything. But the more I read, the more I realized the information on the screen wasn't calming me down. On the contrary, it fueled my imagination. Each line seemed to open up a new possibility, and most of them were possibilities that made me feel uneasy. I began to wonder if I was overreacting, or if this was a perfectly normal human reaction to uncertainty. After a while, I put the phone down on the table. I took a deep breath, trying to feel my breath again. I noticed that when I stopped reading the information, my mind began to slow down a little. Not completely still, but at least not as fast-paced anymore. In that moment, I honestly asked myself, where am I seeking peace? Is it from websites full of warnings, or from the one I still believe holds my life in his hands? I remember a verse from the Bible that I've read many times before, but now it comes to mind in a very clear way. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. 1 Peter 5, verse 7. That saying isn't a promise that all feelings of anxiety will disappear immediately, but it reminds me that I don't need to keep all those anxieties to myself. God doesn't require me to understand everything that's happening in my body. He simply invites me to place my trust in him. I started thinking about it. Isn't it true that we often fear not what's happening now, but what might happen in the future? We read a piece of information, then imagine 10 more possibilities. And the more we imagine, the greater the fear, while the reality before us may still be perfectly normal. When I realized this, I began to feel a very subtle shift within myself, like the surface of water rippling but gradually calming down. I got up and walked to the window. The sky outside had darkened with the approaching evening. The streetlights in the neighborhood began to turn on one by one. Everything looked so peaceful, and I wondered why sometimes our minds can create so many storms even when the world around us is calm. Have you ever realized that the biggest battles sometimes don't happen outside, but within our own thoughts? I returned to bed and sat down. My heartbeat seemed to have slowed down a little, or perhaps it was because I wasn't focusing on it so intensely anymore. As my attention shifted from fear to faith, I began to feel lighter. I don't have all the answers to what my body is going through, but I remember that my life isn't in the hands of websites. My life is in the hands of God, who knows me better than I know myself. I also remember another Bible verse that many of us have heard. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, present your requests to God. Philippians 4, verse 6. What I like about this verse is that it's very practical. It doesn't say we'll never feel anxious, but it shows us what to do when anxiety arises. Instead of letting fear lead our thoughts, we can turn it into a prayer. I thought about that for a moment. If I truly believe that God is taking care of me, then my most natural reaction wouldn't be to keep searching for more things to scare me. The most natural reaction would be to talk to him, not through overly complicated prayers, but simply through genuine sincerity, like a child telling their father they're scared. I've realized that often what tires us out isn't the circumstances, but the constant stream of thoughts in our heads. When we don't stop, when we don't give those thoughts to God, they keep swirling around. But when we stop and remember that we're not facing everything alone, the mind begins to find the peace that seemed to have vanished. The more I think about this, the clearer one thing becomes. Faith doesn't always come in momentous times. Sometimes it appears in very ordinary situations, like when I sit alone in my room and realize I can choose between continuing to be afraid or placing my trust in God. And in that moment, I began to understand that true peace doesn't come from knowing all the answers, but from knowing that God is with me even in the unanswered questions. I sat still on the bed for a little longer. Outside the window, the sky had completely darkened, and the sounds of the evening began to replace the hustle and bustle of the day. In my small room, everything seemed to slow down. What caught my attention wasn't the information on my phone anymore, but a very subtle change in my heart. I realized that when I stopped chasing those frightening thoughts, my mind began to have space to remember something more important. Have you ever noticed that when we stop long enough, faith begins to have a place to speak? I put the phone aside completely, this time not just for a few minutes of rest. I didn't need to read anything more. I had read enough to know that I couldn't find peace in those warning words. Instead, I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The inhale slowly, the exhale more gently. And in that quiet moment, I began to speak to God in a very simple way. Not a formal prayer, just a very honest voice from my heart. I told him that I was worried. I told him that my mind had wandered far because of a small feeling in my body. And I told him that I didn't want to continue living in the spiral of the worst thoughts. As I said those things, I felt like I was putting down a burden that I had unknowingly been holding on to. Perhaps you have experienced this too, when a very simple prayer can lighten your heart more than you realize. In that quiet, I remembered another Bible verse, a very familiar saying, yet one that always brings peace whenever I think of it. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. John 14 verse 27. What I like about this verse is that Jesus didn't say he would give us a life without worries, but he said he gives us peace in a way very different from the world. That peace doesn't come from all problems disappearing instantly. It comes from knowing that we don't face everything alone. I started thinking about it while sitting in a dark room. The anxiety from the afternoon was still there, but it no longer consumed my mind. Instead, there was a very clear realization. There are so many things in life that I cannot control. My body, my future, what might happen tomorrow. But there is one thing I can do right now, and that is to choose to place my trust in God. And sometimes that decision alone is enough to change the way we see things. I lay down in bed, pulling the blanket up a little. The room became quieter as I dimmed the lights. In the soft evening light, I realized my heartbeat had become more normal. Maybe it had been normal for a long time. I just hadn't noticed before because I was so focused on my fear. Have you ever found yourself like that, when we focus so intently on something small that it becomes bigger than it actually is? Meanwhile, another Bible verse came to me as a gentle reminder. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46 verse 10. Sometimes what God calls us to do isn't to seek more answers, but simply to stop. Stop long enough to remember that He is still there. He doesn't leave our lives just because we're feeling anxious. He doesn't lose control just because we don't understand what's happening. I thought about it and felt my heart calm down. Faith, when viewed from the outside, sometimes seems like a very big thing. But in reality, it's often simply a small decision in very ordinary moments. The decision not to let fear lead your mind. The decision to believe that God is still working even when you don't see it clearly. I wonder if anyone listening to this story has ever experienced a similar evening. An evening where a small thought suddenly becomes a huge worry. If you've ever been in that situation, you probably understand the feeling when your mind starts wandering too far. But what comforted me was knowing that God doesn't wait until we're completely calm to approach us. He meets us when we're most anxious. I closed my eyes again, and this time I felt much more at peace than I had earlier that afternoon. Not because all my questions were answered, not because I had found a perfect explanation for the feeling in my body, but because I remembered that my life is in the hands of the one who loves me more than I can comprehend. Before falling asleep, I whispered one more short prayer. I said, Lord, I give you the thoughts I cannot control. I give you the fears that have not yet happened. Please keep my mind closer to you than to the things that worry me. And as I said those words, I felt as if I was laying all the remaining burdens at God's feet. I know that tomorrow there may still be things that make me think. Life isn't always simple, but tonight I learned one thing very clearly. True peace doesn't come from eliminating every possible bad thing. Peace comes from knowing that no matter what happens, God is still holding us in His hands. And with that thought in mind, I let my mind settle. The room was quiet, the night gently enveloping me, and I drifted off to sleep with a simple but firm belief that God was still watching over me, even while I was resting. May God's gentle presence remain with you tonight. May His grace cover your mind, soothe any lingering thoughts, and keep your soul in profound peace. As you rest, may the Lord continue His quiet work, for the seeds sown in this prayer will continue to bear fruit in your life. The Lord gently reminds us, the Lord will watch over your coming and going both now and forevermore. Psalm 121 verse 8. May that promise be an assurance for this night, that God is watching over you, enveloping you in His faithful care. May the peace of the Lord remain in your heart as the night deepens, and walk with you into tomorrow with renewed strength. If this prayer has touched your heart, leave a simple profession of faith such as, the Lord is keeping me safe tonight, and now rest in His cover, knowing that you are safe in God's hands.